예, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about traditional lighting. I'm Lee Sang-il from Chungnam University. It's a great honor for me to be here. I studied archaeology and I'm doing research related to restoring ancient interior space. So my title could be far-fetched from this workshop's focus on modern lighting, but I think it's still insightful and interesting to look in the past of lighting. Compared to its importance, there has been only limited research in the history of lighting, both in the West and the East. We spend half of our time at night, and in order to overcome the night and darkness, we have spent a lot of time and efforts to develop the lighting, but because the nighttime lighting has been so seen as guaranteed, we have neglected the importance of lighting. Especially, we have only limited knowledge about traditional lighting. And when we look at the lighting festivals of traditional lighting, many of them are limited to Joseon Dynasty. These pictures are from Seoul's handheld lantern light festival and Buddhist lotus lantern festivals, and they display the traditional lightings. So in Korea, traditional lightings were mainly symbolized by hanging type lighting or those from Joseon Dynasty. But there are more to traditional lighting of Korea than this. Korean lighting has a long history, and each era had different types of lamps that were popular. But the society generally neglected the history of lighting. So I'm interested in restoring these neglected parts of our history, such as lighting. In Korea, we began studying the lighting in earnest, and we are seeing some more research in China and Japan about lighting history. So we are working with other historians in other countries. So based on this research, I think we're going to have more understanding about the history of lighting in Asia. So let me start my presentation. Traditional lighting in Korea has a long history. There are various types of lighting, but because of limited time, today I would like to talk about the changes in the lighting devices. The first phase, it goes back to prehistoric ages when people began using fire. They used the primitive lighting devices, and lighting enabled people to work at night and also enabled artistic activities. In the prehistoric ages, people used fire mainly for cooking and heating, and they built fire pit inside the cave or dugout huts. And the lighting inside the house was not just for the lighting, but they had multiple other functions as well. In the prehistoric times, Koreans used the indoor lighting. For each area, there were different shapes of residence, but inside the dughouse huts, we see a lot of remains of fire pit. And we can see that people worked indoors at night using the indoor lighting. And in the prehistoric humanity, the people used lighting for artistic activities. In France, Lascaux Cave, we saw animal painting. And in this lighting, we are seeing the stone lamps. So we can see people use the indoor lighting inside the cave to draw paintings on the wall. In Korea, we haven't seen any cave painting with lamps, but we are beginning to see excavate remains of stone lamps similar to the ones that they excavated in France. And we can see the witness and the remains that the people used indoor lighting for artistic activities. And in Europe, there's a lot of research going on for prehistoric lighting. They're using radiocarbon dating technologies to identify the used fuel for the lamp. We want to see such research continue in Korea as well. So phase one of lighting in Korea starts from proto Three Kingdom period. This is when we begin to see devices purely for lighting functions. However, lighting devices in this area was limited to royal families and nobility in the society. And what is noteworthy is the remains we found in a royal tomb in North Korea around Pyongyang area. At that time, people had the ritual of burying the things people used along with the deceased. There are two types of lighting. First, lighting with the stand, and that has multiple arms. And there was another type that's made up of single dish. Especially the lights with multi-armed have been introduced from China. They have ornamental aspects, but the basic structure is the same. And we can see that people had international exchange of lamps at the time. And we can also see other remains from ancient tombs that there were some extravagant lamp devices used in those areas. Phase 2 starts from Three Kingdom period to the initial stage of unified Shilla, and that's when we begin to see diversification of the forms of lamps. Before that, animal fuel was widely used, but in this period, plant-based fuels were introduced, and various functions and use of the lighting devices were developed in this era. As for the main types of lamps, we can see small dish type lamps and outdoor lamps. In the northern part of Seoul, North Korea, there were small dish type lamp that had this coarse areas. In the western part of the peninsula, small dish type lamps were excavated. So depending on the region, a variety of different shapes of the lamps were developed. As for the major types, multiple cup type lamps were identified and excavated from ancient tombs, and many of the lamps were buried in the burial accessory section of the tomb. It used multiple sources of light, and there has been some functional advancement based on X-ray dating. We can see that different cups were all connected through the pipe. So if you pour fuel in one cup, all the cups will be fueled. And we are beginning to see more cups as time passes, and they begin to have more ornamental values. Second is the small dish type lamp, and this is the basic form of Korea's modern lighting as well. They were mainly excavated around Buddhist temples. We can see that along with the introduction of Buddhism, people introduced the lotus lantern offering ritual as well. There were various structures inside the lamp, and based on the analysis of the suit, we realized that there were various ways of lighting the lamp. And also, depending on the fuel, uses of the lamp could be different, and we can see that people tried to use the fuel as efficiently as possible. And small dish type lamps also gave rise to the lamp stands. For effective lighting, it's better to put the lighting source as high as possible. And many of the lamps were made of wood, so there are no remains, but we are seeing remains of iron and bronze lamps. And lamps became popular. As they became popular, we are seeing some handheld portable types of lamps, like shaped as a torch. Because you cannot replenish fuel while you're on the moves, the sizes of portable lamps are relatively big, and in order to fix the wick to prevent fire, there was a separate compartment for wicks as well. This is the period where diverse lamp patterns were developed, and royal families and nobility began using lamps in everyday life, and document administration was also developed based on lighting, and they began to also have symbolic and religious functions. This was a turning point for the lighting culture of Korea. third stage starts from Korea era, and this is when bronze-based lighting devices were developed. In this era, beeswax candles were widely used, and they began using plant-based fuel that produced less smoke. And this is also related to the Buddhist culture. First, regarding the beeswax candle. From this era, we are seeing a lot of remains related to candles. Gyeongju, the capital of unified Shilla, shows this kind of scissors designed for wick cutting, and candlestick stands were excavated in royal palaces and Buddhist temples. And candlesticks also evolved as well. In the unified Shilla era, the candlesticks were ornamental with many legs, but in the Korea, they began to pay more attention to the basic functions. In the unified Shilla, they had the cylinder type stand, but in Korea, they had stands with sharp point on the top. In the Buddhist temples, we are seeing more diverse types of bronze lighting tools, and we are seeing more Buddhist temples in this era, and there was a main focus on lotus lantern offering in Buddhist ritual, and this is when bronze lamps and candlesticks became a part of our everyday life. Along with Buddhism, the stone lanterns were introduced to Korea. Stone lanterns had the pragmatic value of lighting the darkness, and it also had the religious meanings of lighting in our hearts. So stone lanterns are an essential part of Buddhist temples, and various types of stone lanterns were developed in this era. So the biggest characteristics of lighting culture of this era is that they are related to Buddhism. There is the Buddhism ritual that uses 100 lanterns, and UNESCO intangible assets, lotus lantern festivals. They were seen as the major rituals using lamps in Korea. Phase 4 starts with Joseon Dynasty, and lamps have become everyday tools by this era. And for each various lighting tools according to each situation, class, and events were developed, and many different types were fuels used. Previously, lighting culture had a lot of relationship with Buddhism, but now Confucius rituals began to play an important part in lighting. In Joseon Dynasty, there was a lot of painting and documents that still continue until this day, and they give us a lot of information about what kind of lamps were used during that time, and also royal family related documents give us accurate information. And lamps became an essential part of royal rituals, and gilt bronze-based lanterns were used for royal rituals. And Confucianism became an important religion in Joseon Dynasty, and lamps became an essential part of Confucius ritual, especially for weddings as well. In this process, candles began to be used more widely than lamps, but in the past there was limited amount of beeswax, so depending on the class and events, different types of candles were used. For noble or royal families ritual, they used beeswax-based candles, but for ordinary people, they used insect wax or take sweat, lower quality candles were used. But for weddings, even the ordinary people were allowed to use beeswax candles. Let's look at the nobleman's lamps. The Buddhist monks and royal families and nobilities were the only ones who could use lamps in the past, but in Joseon Dynasty, lamps became in everyday life. So there were various types of lighting here. The first type is that they had the candlesticks. They were made of wood or metal, and they had a reflector that was strongly ornamental. There was limited production of candle, so oil lamps were used together with candles. So we can often find lampstand. They look similar to candlesticks, but the lamp is slightly tilted for efficient usage of oil. And for indirect lighting And also to prevent the light going off by the wind, the wooden frame covered with paper was also used. Floor lamps were widely used. And here, handheld lamps were widely used in various forms. Sticks held, a frame hanging from the stick was widely used, and they were often covered with the cloth or papers. And for functional advancement, to widen the distance and intensify the lighting of light, there were handheld lamps that projected light in a very specific area, like modern flashlights. The noble people's lamps were mainly for aesthetic beauty, but the ordinary people used more crude or rough-shaped lighting, and instead of candles, they used more oil lamps. And another characteristic about this era is that there was a lot of hanging lamps that could be hung on the walls. And also high-quality stone lamps were widely used in Joseon dynasty. And these stone lamps were specialty in Korea. So the Chinese envoys, whenever they came to Korea, always brought stone lamps. The last phase of traditional lighting, phase 5, begins in the modern times. This is when the fossil fuel and electricity was introduced in Korea that has brought about major changes in our lighting culture. They were introduced mainly around the metropolitan area, bringing significant changes to urban landscape. But rural areas continued to use traditional lighting for a longer period of time until they had modern infrastructure. As for fuels, we began using fossil fuel in the modern times. Fossil fuels are highly volatile, and they needed seal lamps with a lid on the top. And they had high absorption functions, so pottery or metals began to be used. But depending on how fast this culture was accepted, there were different types of fuels and lamps used, but the lampstand still followed the traditional structure. As the new technologies were widely introduced, they began to change the shape of lamps as well. In the past, they only had changes on the cap and the material, but the lamp devices became Western-typed oil lamps. And the new fuels were easy to be supplied, and they had absolute advantage in terms of times and intensity. So the traditional lamps were phased out quickly. And electricity was introduced and spread quickly in Korea. And in 1883, Joseon envoys visited the United States, and that's when they learned about the advanced technologies and electricity power, and they have worked to introduce electricity in Korea. In 1884, they signed a contract with American company Edison Electric Light Company, and the first electric light was lit in Gyeongbok Palace in 1887. And we've done some archaeological excavation around the royal palace area, and electric power plant and remains were excavated around Gyeongbok Palace. So the electric lights changed our nightscapes fundamentally, and street lights were introduced, and people began enjoying nightlife as well. When the royal palaces were open to public, people began enjoying cherry blossoms at night time in the royal palace. And we built street lights around the urban area, and modern buildings were introduced, and nightscape has changed fundamentally, and shop signs began to be illuminated, and commercial activities continued into the nighttime. Even in the indoors, lighting has created a lot of changes. The lighting hung on the ceiling became much more brighter, and restaurants and stores were kept open even at night. The modern houses also came with the electric lights. In the modern eras, clothes and food remained conventional or traditional for a long time, but the electricity light had an absolute advantage over the conventional lighting. So in less than 50 years of introduction of electricity, the traditional lighting all but disappeared in Korea. So we've learned about traditional lighting, the culture and history in Korea. It starts from prehistoric times and has changed its forms, evolved and diversified, but with the introduction of new technologies, it has brought about the end of traditional lighting in Korea. Because of the limited time, I wasn't able to share everything about the history of Korea's traditional lighting culture, but I have given you the gist of our history, and I hope you can continue to be interested in the history of traditional lighting in Korea. Thank you very much.